Good evening and welcome everyone. Hope everyone can hear and see me. My name is Nina Boccia and I'm the Marketing and Communications Lead at Lemay. On behalf of Lemay, I'd like to thank you for starting your work week with us tonight. We're very pleased to support and collaborate with DesignTO again this year, distanced and digital. Before we begin, Lemay acknowledges the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of the many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We ask you to consider supporting cultural revitalization initiatives such as the Art for Aid project, an organization that connects Indigenous youth to art and knowledge of their culture by ensuring art supplies are provided to remote schools and communities. I'd now like to welcome Deborah Wang, the Artistic Director at DesignTO, to say a few words.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nina. DesignTO is a nonprofit arts organization that's best known for its annual DesignTO Festival happening now, and as Nina said, distanced and digitally from January 22nd to the 31st. With pandemic regulations constantly changing, you may have questions about the festival. There are 40 exhibitions and events to experience online, like this one. And for those of you who want to head out for a daily dose of fresh air, there are 35 window installations across the city, which are viewable from the outdoors. Plus, there are more projects you can browse online that have been postponed. Please keep physically distanced from others at all times. I want to say that I'm very much looking forward to this talk, moderated by Zara Ibrahim, a longtime DesignTO friend, and organized by Lemay, a partner and supporter of the festival. In the context of the pandemic, systemic racism, and inequality, discussing how design and architecture needs to operate beyond their normal preoccupations is both timely and salient. Thank you. Back to you, Nina.
Thank you, Deborah. Tonight's event, A Crisis in Relevance, is a moderated conversation on how an engaged and collaborative and transdisciplinary approach to design inspires reform and transformation in our communities and our work. If time permits, we'll open this up to questions from attendees before we close. And we do have a short survey at the end of the event, and we hope you'll take a few minutes to fill it out. We're very happy to have this panel moderated by Zara Ibrahim, who will introduce our speakers. Zara is a public interest designer and strategist focused on shifting power to people who are typically underrepresented in institutions and systems. Her work is focused on deep community-led approaches to policy, infrastructure, and service design. She's a co-founder of Monumental, an organization focused on supporting an equitable recovery that builds fair and just cities and institutions. I'll leave it to Zara now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nina. And like, here we are. You know, I said this as we were getting together on Zoom ahead of 6 o'clock, but this is a long overdue conversation and what company to be having it with. So welcome to the 71 people who are here with us tonight, and of course to all the panelists. I did say I'm not going to read their impressive and lengthy and amazing bios, but I do just want to flag some themes that sort of move across all of our panelists, and then I'll introduce them in short. I think what's beautiful about the conversation we're going to have today is that each and every one of you on this panel travels between community, between the academic world, between practice, and no one part makes up the whole, like, you know, the entirety of your practice. That you see that balance across all those spaces is really critical to your role as a designer. And we'll talk obviously more about that. I want to introduce Andrew King, who is a senior partner and chief design officer at Lemay, as well as the principal of the firm's research and design lab, an incredibly decorated and celebrated architect, a fellow of the RAIC, professor in practice at the School of Architecture at McGill University. We have Marie El-Noir, who is an architect and design leader at the firm's at Lemay's Research and Design Lab, believing in collaborative integrated design approach that puts architectural experimentation at the heart of her practice. We will want to be talking a ton about that. Cheryl Atkinson is a principal at Atkinson Architects in Toronto and associate professor at Ryerson University in architecture, and has had a long and esteemed career in community and educational building design prior to her work at Ryerson and Atkinson when she was part of Teeple Architects. And Michael Lee Poi, who is an Afro-Caribbean artist, activist, and architect in Trinidad and Tobago. His practice and interests are centered on post-colonial Caribbean design and fabrication in the festival arts. Michael's bio talks so much about all the things that pull at my heartstrings: decolonizing learning, decolonizing design, and sort of deconstructing this idea of the hero's journey in design, which I really want to get into because, dear God, we have talked about the architect as the overlord for so long, and I really want to sort of talk through how you use that as part of your educational practice and your architectural practice. So welcome to all of you. So we're going to start, maybe actually what I'll do is I'll just set a little bit of context, and then I'll pass it to each of you to sort of talk about how you come to this conversation. I think, Deb set it up so beautifully that we're in this moment where everything is reckoning, and it's stirring and recalibrating. In some cases, long overdue. In some cases, making vast amounts of progress away from, where we thought progress lived. And so, architecture is very much central to that. And it's very much been insulated in so many ways because of its capital P professional status. It's been insulated from some of these conversations about radical change. And so tonight, we're just going to talk about that. What does it mean to be an architect today? What is happening? What revolutions, what reforms are happening that are fundamentally changing the practice? How are you sort of balancing what this looks like in your teaching and how it shows up and it manifests in the world, in what you build and what you collaborate on building, and then some hope, right? Like where should we be looking? Where would you orient us as a design community, if you had the opportunity to share that? So that's sort of the arc of our evening tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Michael, and I'm going to give you the floor for a few minutes. And just tell us how you come to this conversation, this moment of relevance and renewal in the architectural practice. You're on mute, friend.
Wow. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for the invite. Firstly, on behalf of OCAD University, I acknowledge the ancestral and traditional islands of the Taino, Arawak, and Caribs, who are the original owners and custodians on the land on which we live, work, create, make mass, etc. I'm in Trinidad and Tobago right now for obvious reasons, pandemic and stuff. But how do I arrive here? Well, I was invited, first of all, to begin with. And what a great discussion. Relevance, as Marie said in our conversation, it comes up every decade or so, like a style. Why are we here? What are we doing? And all of that sort of confusion. And we understand this. We recognize this as practicing architects. This happens. It's been going on for a long time. But outside of that, in our conversations, I think a thread that tied us together was this idea that our practice is more than just buildings, right? So it's this thinking, not design thinking, but creative thinking, and that's what ties us together, and it just breaks so many boundaries in opening the doors for students and thinking about the world as a bigger place and collaborating. That's what we do very well. We collaborate very, very well. So if you call me an artist, well, I'm a proud practicing collaborative artist as well, because that's my architectural practice. The hero's journey, heartstrings for my great teacher, Mimi Lobel, and her husband. And I just continued the sort of, how should I say it, sharing the hero's journey process with architectural students, different from other fields, architectural students, and allowing them an opportunity from wherever they come from to speak about their personal journey. And it's reflected in this hero who they choose as a client, right? You design something for them. In architectural school, it'd be something architectural. But as I teach it down here in Trinidad and Tobago, it could be anything. And as you research your hero, you're researching yourself and sharing all your great values, and you turn that into something that's, that's beautiful, that's new, that nobody else created for that client. So in that regard, that story is for everybody. It's diverse. It decolonizes the process. Joseph Campbell, if all of you haven't read that book, it's wonderful. Hero of a Thousand Faces, published in the 30s. But that gave inspiration to Star Wars and to The Matrix and to all these stories, right? So that's how I kind of enter it. And I have to plug my university. And we're talking about decolonization, not just talking. It's written into the DNA of our school, and it's a process, right? It doesn't happen overnight, but we're doing it, and through our Black Cluster Hire and everyone, all the allies that made that happen. It wasn't just Dean Dorey; it was the whole school that came together and put that hiring cluster together. So plug you, OCAD, you.
Well, a well-deserved plug. And we were just talking about this, that, identity needs to be so central to our design practice, understanding who we are, and how we come to this, is something that we don't often historically do enough work in design school with students to sort of unpack and look at their own intersectionalities, their own journeys as part of how they come to their design practice and approach. So thank you. Thanks for bringing that in. Michael, I'm going to let you choose who's next. Who are you passing the baton to?
Well, I'll pass it to Cheryl because her work is, in the same vein. And I was loving what she was telling us in the discussion about her projects. Yeah.
Over to you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Michael. Well, it's a topical question for sure. Relevance. What's the relevance of architecture right now in this place and time, in the midst of both environmental crisis and a crisis of equity, diversity, justice, and an economic crisis for everybody as well. So I'm predominantly a teacher at the moment, I would say. I practice a bit, and I practice doing work that I think is valuable and important, and it's mostly in the environmental side. So I'm interested in housing accessibility, and have been working with small developers doing net zero energy, net zero carbon infill housing that's prefabricated. So trying to hit all those things to make responsible buildings that have the potential of maybe becoming affordable in Toronto. So we're actually working on a couple development sites, and it's also going to be rental. So I have found the most amazing developers in Toronto who actually care about all these things. So that's quite nice to be doing. And that comes out of a project I did a few years ago that was exhibited at Edit DX, which was a prototype of one of these houses that we built with Chris Magwood up in Northern Ontario. So it was all built by students, transported down to the site at the Edit DX exhibition at the Unilever site. And then it was purchased, which is what paid for it, and it's now being monitored to see how it performs. But I think what Michael's talking about doing is my more recent projects, which have been with our students on developing ways to really engage with communities that are experiencing crisis. And we worked on a project last semester with my third year students in Little Jamaica. And that came out of just a feeling that I had that we needed to do something after Black Lives Matter happened with a specific community. So we're not just talking about place and program, but people. And they're experiencing incredible gentrification. And so we discovered an organization, and working on that project, OACC, the Open Architecture Collective Canada, who worked on a kind of survey with the community and the local business community, along with BUTO, Black Urban Toronto, to put together a voice for this community. And we used that as a template to develop a cultural center as a project with the students. So they did a public space project in addition to a cultural center for the Black diaspora in that neighborhood, which is undergoing incredible stress from the Eglinton crosstown and ongoing gentrification. And then that translated into a project that we just finished a week ago with the entire school, which was this huge charrette, 400 students, 45 teams of 8 students each, vertically integrated between graduate students and undergraduate students. And we took on South Parkdale as a project to do a workshop over a charrette. I think everybody probably at this event knows what a charrette is. A workshop that lasted for 4 days. So 2 days of kind of diving deep into the raw data from the neighborhood that we assembled into packages and challenge questions that engaged all kinds of information directly from the community and different social agencies that have been working there for some time. So dealing with issues of gentrification, affordable housing, access to healthy food, jobs, you name it, they're in the midst. I mean, the housing crisis is probably the biggest issue. And the students created personas after empathizing with these stories. Ideally, they would have been able to engage with people directly, but we had to do it all digitally through anecdotal information and videos and that sort of thing. So they created personas, fictional personas, narratives, and then approached design. So they weren't supposed to start with an idea the way they're typically taught to deal with architecture projects, but start with the people, start with their issues, imagine and empathize with the scenario that they're in, and then come up with a design idea that would have impact. So I could talk about what the outcomes were for a long time, but there were, it was about thinking strategically. It was about thinking creatively about how you work with minimal amounts of resources, making things do double duty, thinking about systems that could work through the neighborhoods. And so I'll leave it there because I'm taking up too much time.
Yeah, this is all of your panel, so not at all. I just want to note before I'll give you a breath to choose who you're passing it to, but I just want to surface that an anecdote, which was 15 years ago when I was starting out, going from architecture firm to architecture firm. This is before I started my practice. And I remember asking them, I was like, so what sort of research practice, like qualitative research practices? And, sort of eyes rolled to the back of their heads. They were like, does she know where she is? She's in an architecture firm. Why is she asking about qualitative research? Why is she asking about community voice? So like my heart just grew like 6 sizes hearing you talk about sort of centering the narrative, right? Centering stories as legitimate inputs into an architectural process like that. you have no idea. I think there's probably so many people on this call who hear that and go, finally, right? The lived experience of people should be central to our designs. And we need to name it, and we need to talk about it, and we need to have processes for it. So thank you for bringing that in. Cheryl, who are you passing it to?
I'll pass it to Marie.
Hey, yeah, so I mean, regarding the topic itself, I can't say that I come from a place of, of expertise. I don't have the 25, 30-year career that my colleagues here have, but I do come from a place of, I guess, like deep curiosity and observation. And, I've been intrigued by that question of relevance for a long time, like I guess many of my peers and the students that I talk to. And everybody, regardless their age, is really trying to find, meaning in what they do. And, for me as a professional, I think it's really about trying to understand the complexity, of the world and the kind of various intricate dynamics of the world we live in to eventually better respond to the challenges that it proposes, and as a designer. And I think that, many of us, and mostly maybe because as a reflex, we tend to solve those problems with designing more and designing better. And it's, it's understandable. We're architects. This is usually what we do. But when we start to dig even a little bit, you kind of quickly find out that there's like many ways that you can actually gain or regain, agency in change. And also, I mean, I had the chance to circle the academic world for a couple of years, having like different roles, as advisor and lecturer and critic, and even as a teacher a little bit. And for me, it's really also about really showing students the spectrum, of the profession, and not limiting their view about architecture and its impact in the world. Because I do think that the role of the architect changed over time, whether we like it or not. I think that's the time when, and then you talked about the hero's journey, but I think that the time when, the figure of the architect as this, singular hero carrying the weight and the glory of entire projects on their shoulder, I do think that this time is, coming to an end. And for the better, I think we still might have some architects, here and there continuing this, this fantasy. But I think that, and especially younger generations have more and more difficulty, relating to that narrative, and it's actually really unhelpful. It puts emphasis on individuals where we know that projects are done collectively. It vilifies, the concept of compromise, as if it was the enemy of perfection, whatever that term really means. And it puts, form over purpose. I think it presents like all sorts of assumptions as, paramount, when we actually know that there's so much more and so much more, things that are important, and it's way more important to be a good collaborator rather than, be a control freak. And I think that, but instead we should put forward, qualities that will help us in our work and making changes that are actually worthwhile. It's about being collaborative and curious enough about all the disciplines to be able to at least hold conversation with people outside our domain. And it's about being able to work at multiple scale. And it's about being able to marry pragmatic ideas with emotions and the various stories that we hear. I mean, and they're all way more valuable than this kind of fallacy that the architect we see as this godlike figure. So for all of those reasons, like this idea of relevance is such an important and interesting discussion to have.
Thanks so much, Marie. I think it's tough when it's a practice that's has licensing and all these like sort of formalities, and it's hard, I think, for folks to hear on the other side of that journey. you're part of a kaleidoscope, like where we need many folks to sort of construct this beautiful picture. We need many inputs. We need architects. We need artists. We need, we need organizers. We need everyone. You're making me think of the phrase experts on tap, not on top, which is just such a beautiful recalibration. But I still think we're getting from here to there. We're in the process. So thank you for that. Andrew, I think you're up.
Oh, I was looking forward to Marie introducing me.
So Marie,
Here's Andrew.
Kudos to, first of all, kudos to DesignTO. I mean, over 70 people is what we had on the last year with the one in-house in Toronto. So that was pretty good showing. So that's great. Kudos to you, Zara, for acquiescing responsibility almost immediately as a moderator by getting us to do your work for you. That's a trick that I actually I'm really good at too. This notion that you guys talking about, there's lots to riff on. I really like this notion about the formalities of practice. When we met last year at PopCan Crit, it was really about the relationship between practice and what we wanted to get out of practice. I came out of a theater background. I was an actor, director, and a scenographer, and really interested in critical theater. I came out of a background where this notion that we make stories, and we make stories about our culture. We make stories to create a kind of critical context. So my practice model, and I guess, you've been asking us, the other things I'd riff on was really this notion of thinking strategically, or strategically thinking, this notion of going into an office and asking about research, where the research lies. If somebody came into my practice, either any number of it, either with Marie in the room or not, we have a really clear answer about where that lands, and we think that it's really important. But you're right, you do get this look about kind of what the hell are you talking about in most normative practices. Nina has probably just checked the box about how soon it took me to swear, at least in a minor way. But this notion that strategically thinking as a driver really formed, we talked about sort of where we're coming from. I'm going to steal a word from Marie. I'm always impressed. Marie's second language is English, and she gives me words all the time. And we were talking about a particular aspect, and she mentioned the sort of crisis of agency. And if I was going to talk about what I've been trying to do over the last 30 years, it's really finding agency for whether it's shifting ideas, whether it's a notion around how we frame the worlds in which we're making. I don't want to be too general, but I also don't want to be too sort of preposterous about suggesting that maybe we're acting critically all the time and when we're not. But this notion about the finding an agency, for me, the first world was not just architecture, not just even design. It was about books, exhibitions. We made films. We were going through that model. As having a conversation with Lev Bradashenko a few days ago about a publication project, which talks about almost at that point, and still I think, the sort of promiscuity of practice, the fact that you have to be able to move between and back and forth, and that if you have to be very, very fluid about the foils in which you choose, I think to move forward. I really like this. So this fluidity of practice, and then this fluidity of practice is actually becoming a project that Marie and I are working on right now within Lemay, and it's the sort of radically revising the Lemay lab as it becomes a new device around this crisis of relevance, which is why we think this is such an interesting subject, and really this notion about how architecture can be an activist force. How we can find sort of positions that move us forward, how we can actually take risks out of that formality of practice, out of the issues that sort of frame the normative notion of practice so clearly. Say we're moving out of that at this point because we want to take risks, we want to do this. It's easy to do. If you've got some security, it's easy to do if you've got other things going on, but it's easy to do. It's still risky. I also wanted to talk about Michael's notion on this idea of cycles, the cycles of our crisis of relevance. I'm old enough, I know I don't look it, but I'm old enough to have gone through a couple of cycles of this notion. My first few years in practice were in London. And in Berlin, and almost a decade working in Berlin, where the crisis was an ideological one, just after the Berlin Wall fell, where essentially the physical culture of a place was really trying to re-identify itself within a kind of radically different ideological position. And that's why I stayed in Berlin for so long. It was fascinating to see how the city was responding, how the individuals were responding, how the individual practitioners, how the artists. I have a long-term collaboration and various art practices, and I think that it's inextricably linked to an architecture practice. But this notion of relevance at that time was really about ideological positions, where we land, where our identity is within the construct of that 20th century, late 20th century crisis around how our systems frame our identity. So this certainly the crisis around resilience, the crisis around sustainability and our climate is absolutely key. And then these I don't want to say emerging, they've been there for a long time, but this notion of inclusion and the fact that we've got some very key projects right now that we're working on both in Lemay and then some of the work we're doing at McGill around a sort of a radical sense of inclusion. Going back to Michael's points about, I think, or maybe it was your point, Zara, about embracing the intersectionality of students. And we're in the middle of doing that right now. We're starting a studio. It's a first year studio. I sort of bounce between first year and grad studios, and it's really about where those students have landed, how they've landed here, and what they want to explore, and that notion about bringing your issues to bear rather than other ones. Anyway, I'll stop. I'll stop now. I can just keep going. But the finding agency is it may become the subtext to the next whatever, and I'll credit Marie somewhere in the back.
I think it's important to surface that, because in this, crisis of relevance, it is a crisis, right? Not everyone behaves well in a crisis. And so I think bringing, the agency of like, who fills what roles? Like, what do we need in order to rebuild? What do we need in order to create our built environment communities, resilient communities, and just kind of renewing that role and being clear about it, I think, is so important. Marie, you mentioned, I feel like we're at the end of that era, the overlord architect, and, combined with Michael's comments about seasons, I was like, what season are we in? Are we in fall? Like, are we letting the leaves mulch the soil and the seeds of our regeneration are sort of going into the ground? So feel free to riff on that. But Marie, I do want to go to you to sort of pick up the conversation, because in the sort of discussion prior to this panel, you flagged a Liam Young quote: "The architect's skills are wasted in making buildings." And I think we've all got feelings about that. So I would love for you to riff on that, but point us towards what are the unique skills of an architect? What are they well used for? And in the lens of sort of, are they well used to embrace architecture as, a form of activism, or the practice as a form of activism?
Yeah, for sure. It's that quote, and as I was saying earlier today, like it's stuck with me. Like since I've heard it a couple of years ago, it's really stuck with me. It's a great quote, and some people will say that it's provocative, and it kind of undermines the profession. And for me, it's really actually quite inspiring when trying to find answer to the question of relevance. And, I think that it would be interesting to understand, I guess, first the context of it. And I think first of all, contextually, we operate, in a context that is affected by this, multifaceted crisis, as Cheryl was talking about. It's political, it's economical, it's technological, it's social, it's ecological. Like, we get it, we get it all, basically. But I think that there might also be things that we do as architects and designers that don't really help. I mean, and the first one being maybe like an obvious one, but I think that architects still underestimate the implication and the impact of built environments, on the planet, on cities, on communities. But I feel that at least, there's kind of an awareness and there's acknowledgement of that problem. And a lot of the architectural education and culture is now kind of to start to focus on that problem, which is great. But I think that there's another problem that is a little bit more complicated, and it's a little bit more, harder to handle as a profession. And is that, while we kind of underestimate the impact of built environments, we also kind of overestimate our real power in shaping those environments within our traditional role as architects. When you read about these crazy statistics about our involvement in construction, I think, like, I've read that architects are only meaningfully involved in something like 2% of the creation of buildings around the world. I mean, you kind of realize that there's something quite wrong with how we are handling our end of the social contract. I mean, we spend years and years studying and even more years getting licensed. And, if students think that the only career path is to design, beautiful country houses and cater to the needs of very wealthy clients, I just don't think it's the complete picture of, what they could do with that education. As you were, as your question kind of point out, we learn critical thinking, we learn problem solving, how to engage physically in space, how to put contradicting ideas and concepts together in coherent narratives. I mean, we don't just amalgamate data, we actually dramatize it, we push it through cultural filters. Design is a fascinating education and process, and for now we're mostly limiting ourselves to what we know, which is making buildings. But we have the skills to be strategists and policymakers and storytellers and planners. And I don't think it's that far-fetched to actually claim that. I mean, we just need to diversify the definition of our profession, and and just to be open and searching for alternative, I guess, modes of practice. And as Andrew was talking about, this idea of agency, it surely is a way to regain agency and to put the architect back into systems and to forces that actually can make change and really transform cities. And and sometimes, and most of the time, it actually goes beyond the act of making buildings. Now it's through policies, it's through culture, it's through so many things. Building is one small component of it, but I think the architecture, the architectural education gave us so many skills that we're kind of underutilizing right now.
Michael, Cheryl, Andrew, want to riff on this question? Is it inspiring any ideas, Andrew?
If I can, just because I'm old enough to forget my points if I don't get them in quickly. But this notion that there's I love the quote about wasting our skills on buildings, but actually, for me, it's and I think for people who I either was educated with or sort of formed normative practices with, it sort of goes with, it doesn't go without saying, obviously it needs to be said, but it's part of that world. I've always said architecture is this big tent. A couple of times I've been asked whether somebody should go to architecture school, and I always say yes, because even if you don't want to be an architect, even if you don't want to do buildings, an architectural education is something that just sort of cracks open the world almost immediately. And this sort of notion of an architectural education is a way of looking, strategically at many things. I mean, on the bad side, there's that point in architectural education where all of a sudden you can't look at the world in any way but critically. So all of a sudden, lots of it is ugly, lots of it is inconsequential, lots of it is insufficient, lots of it is failing. But I think this notion that you're given that in your education process, then yes, for sure, buildings are, if not the least, then buildings are part of a very little that you can do. And even I look at the work that I've done over 30 years of practice, only part of it is buildings, and sometimes it's the most disappointing part of it. And then, but you get your ideas out through these other mechanisms. And I think we have to continue to embrace that condition. You look at the anyway, there's all kinds of models, filmmakers, musicians, whatever, they're brought to various other disciplines through a kind of construct of the architectural education as this broader. But what we don't make buildings, we make processes, we make manifestos or positions, we make journeys. That's what we're designed to make. And when I teach my students, that's what I say. It doesn't really matter if this project has failed in that way. What have you learned about the way you think? Mm-hmm. And that seems to be key. And that's why when we bring it to when we bring that level of engagement to some projects, to some clients, to also, frankly, to the decades-long struggle of redesigning the practice, redesigning what we're doing and why we're doing it critically. And I think it's key. Hopefully that made some sense, because I actually pushed my way in to get it out.
Absolutely. Michael, Cheryl.
I would say it's interesting how design thinking is terminology that other professions and businesses are adopting, and other education models are adopting. You know, just being in a university within an engineering school, and they're all trying hard to, you know, to do experiential learning projects, and they recognize the value of it in project-oriented projects, and integrated design and lateral thinking. I mean, it's just in our DNA, and it always has been, and it's just everybody else in the world now is recognizing this is an important skill to be able to think, to use your intuition, as well as be highly trained and skilled and knowledgeable about a lot of other related things, and to be able to then synthesize that. It's definitely an important skill, and we can use it in lots of ways for sure. Michael.
You keep leaning forward and then someone else starts talking.
Yeah, all salient points. I'd like to toggle back to what Marie said about the 2% of architects that produce or design architecture in the world. And if we unpack that a little bit, I think most of it is civic architecture, right? And then you have to ask, who's doing the rest? Who's doing the 98%? And how are you defining those people, right? And so if they're doing it, then they're kind of practicing architecture without the degrees and, the registration and stuff like that. So I think it's also redefining what our practice is, which we do anyways, right? What about the irrelevance of silos? Right? because we do this all the time. We're practicing our narrative, and I think that's what Andrew was kind of saying through his different mediums and his history, that this constant narrative, expressing it whether through film or through something else, it's always consistent. We're always doing this. Sometimes it's sustainable narrative, sometimes it's something else, but it's all, it all shifts and changes depending on the economic circumstances and things like that. So less silos, more education, more sort of this, I hate to say design thinking, right? more
Yeah.
This creative thinking is needed. And in addition to that is that in this process, in the last 6 months, it just came to the face that architects we're not essential, right? Creatives are not essential when it comes down to, global pandemics. We can't move across borders like other people, maybe lawyers and doctors, but the amount of education we go through, come on, I should be able to marry somebody, right? At this stage. I'm just saying. That's my 2 cents on that.
I mean, while you have the floor and while you're unmuted, I love, you've talked about how you think through your hands, like what you make is an expression of your thoughts. And I imagine as an artist, as an architect, you're thinking about politics, you're thinking about identity, you're thinking about the world, you're thinking about, so the expression of the artifact is about your state of mind, not even, about artifact worship. And I think it touches on, things we've heard everyone talk about, which is this, that architects think about the world in this really expansive way. But we don't necessarily name that in the in the educational process. And so I'd love to hear more about how you are sort of renewing your own, design education, your practice as a design educator. Feel free to talk about the hero's journey. We're all super keen to hear about that. But, how are you infusing some of this thinking around the social and political role that architects can play into your design education practice?
That's a big question. You didn't ask other people. on.
Go
Well,
where you want.
yeah,
Go where
but
you
yeah,
want.
yeah, but
Here
now
we
we know
go.
now we know which question is coming.
Right. So I'm the guinea pig, and you guys
Yeah,
get your
yeah.
questions ready.
Twice now you've been the guinea pig.
Here's the TLDR. What's changing about the way you teach design students? What's shifting?
Well, I'm in an art. I'm not in just in an art and design school. I'm
Yeah.
in one of the best in North America. And although I didn't know the history of OCAD-U, it's I knew the building because we're architects and we know those really interesting buildings that happen around the world. So I knew that building, but I didn't know what was inside or what was happening. What's my sort of challenge and my role is to bring Afro-Caribbean design pedagogy into that, right? And how do we talk about that? How do I talk about carnival in art and through architecture? And there are ways. Nobody's done it before, but I'm going to do my best in talking about this experiential system of oh my gosh, it's hard to explain carnival, and it's emancipation festival that everybody's invited to, and it's been practiced for hundreds of years. So Lady Gaga put meat on her body as a kind of a fashion statement. We did that 100 years ago, and there's kind of record of that too. So these these wild sort of experiential things have been done and practiced as a way to a social commentary of the colonial system, and that happened in costume, and then a musical instrument, the only one in the 20th century, the steel pan, was invented here, and that was from the ghetto, pretty much from the ghetto, and how do you talk about this innovative space happening every year for hundreds of years, and nobody's thought about design anthropology, right? So that's sort of my goal, to break it open. Also, plug my OCAD-U teacher staff who have pivoted through this moment. Come to Trinidad for vacation, Trinidad and Tobago, and enjoy it and look at how we look at things differently, and it's very fascinating. Like Andrew was there in Berlin when the wall was going down, and as a scientist, really, he didn't run, he didn't say, "No, I got to get out." It's just like, let's see how this, what happens here, and that's what we do. We think, we watch, we step back, and all of that becomes part of our wisdom and our way to sort of teach and respond to the moment. We do respond to the moment, but because our projects are, minimum a year, oh my gosh, 3 years, 10 years.
That's optimistic, yeah.
And then you ask yourself, how did Frank Lloyd Wright do 400 buildings or houses, right? Or others, right? And things like that back then. Anyways, I pass on the baton.
I mean, you're all educators. Cheryl, I'm looking, you can't see, but I'm making eye contact with you. What's the world like at Ryerson?
You mean now as opposed to then, or just? I think it's interesting teaching there. I teach in mostly third year, and I'm teaching a graduate studio now. And then I did that for the last couple of years. I've done this big charrette once a year. I think I would agree with what Marie was saying, that I think students are used to the idea that they work collaboratively, and it is hard because that hasn't been the tradition in architecture school. We've always emphasized the loner project, but we have a lot of courses called collaborative this and integrated that, and there is a lot of teamwork, and I think they're really getting good at it. And maybe it's something they're also picking up in their work terms, because a lot of them are co-op students as well. So yeah, I think it's changing the way we teach. I mean, we're cognizant of it as educators, and I think our students are certainly picking up on it, and they're working better than ever. It was interesting, after running that collaborative exercise, people who've done it before always had these peer reviews where they get the students to say how well they participated. And I just couldn't bear the idea of doing that, getting 1,000 pieces of paper from people saying what they thought about so-and-so. And I just said, if you have a problem, notify me, but otherwise, and I didn't get one complaint. So I think they are collaborating. But all schools of architecture, and it's probably true of every educational department, is going through a reckoning with equity, diversity, and inclusion. And our school is incredibly culturally diverse. I mean, you just look at the names in any single group, and they're from all over the world. And they tend not to be super well-off kids either. So a lot of them, they might be the first member of the family that's getting a professional education, and it's a big deal. So they treat it very seriously, and work hard at it. So yeah, things are changing, and yeah, we had our moment, just like many schools, I think, with what happened in the spring, where students wanted to know what we were going to do about this officially in the school. So we now have a organization or a committee that's working with students, and it's a combined effort with students and faculty within our department, but also at the next level up in the from the department to the faculty. And they're regularly meeting, and we're talking about the ways we can change the history and theory curriculum to be more culturally diverse. How do we get more of a voice from Indigenous people in the school without tokenizing it? It's how can the projects be more relevant to other destinations and cultures? So it's changing very quickly. Actually, there's been a big conversation this fall about it, for sure. This past fall.
Yeah, it's something that I, this afternoon was in another conversation about, just talking about how even deciding where design begins, right? A few hundred years ago, 300, 400 years ago, one of Michael's colleagues, Michael's dean, was, just sharing that, design started thousands and thousands of years ago, and we don't bring that into the history. So I love to hear that that's part of your practice. Marie, Andrew, how is your architectural sort of and design, teaching and educational approach? How is it shifting and changing?
You want to start, Andrew?
It's interesting, because I think to some degree, Marie's and my teaching are linked, at least across one studio that we did last year, quite collaboratively. And I mean, for me, it goes back to that sort of promiscuity in some way. It's like I've been to lots of different schools. I'm established at McGill now as a professor of practice, and I had their chef visiting critic appointment at one point. But I find that it follows this notion of practice. It follows the fact that my practice model has changed. So I find my role at schools kind of now is almost to be, the professor of practice appointment, the person who actually spends most of their time in practice, leading an office of different, or understanding that offices can exist in different sizes and leading them in different ways, but trying to do things within it, means that when I'm in the school, or normatively, that's like, okay, this is the guy that actually practices. And all the baggage around what you called, Zara, the formalities of practice have to be part of that. Whereas I kind of don't do that at all. I actually bring in, I'm teaching right now with conceptual artists, and we're doing a studio that we've done different versions of over the years. So this notion that this transdisciplinary approach, that a critical way of thinking is part of the practice, and it's the person, the guy that's actually in practice that actually thinks about things in this way. So what we, and that was the same when Marie and I talked together. It was really talking about how can you crack open practice? How do you actually talk about the sort of breadth of it in a way? And so that really, I see that as my role, and the fact that I'm actually doing buildings at the same time, and we can go out and tour a $2 billion hospital or a whatever if they want to, but we can also talk about very esoteric art practices, or an understanding of how how film and David Lynch's position on the world can affect the way you do design, or what atmosphere means, blah 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 blah. Anyway, I see my position in education as really making that breadth clear, and not limited. I hope that's what I do. I mean, maybe that's aspirational. Embedded in that is this these days is this notion of inclusion, is this notion of the fact that the projects that we're taking on, I have the privilege of working on projects that address these issues, and then we can apply that. And again, for me, it is about applied research. Anyway, I'm sorry, Maria. Maria has been a great collaborator in the teaching, and it's been amazing to watch. But I'll introduce her. How about that? There you
go. Yeah. So on my end, I mean, as I said earlier, like I was lucky enough to be kind of circling the academic world for a couple of years, and of course not as long as my colleagues here, but every time I had to come in front of those students in any of the roles that I had, like I would ask myself, if I were in their shoes, what would I want to learn from a 30-something-year-old? And and I think that there is, of course, tremendous value in experience and, particular approaches and design methodologies. But I also think there's a kind of unexpected value in just sharing convictions and deeply held beliefs, that are more about human qualities and just like, fundamental kind of state of mind. Things like, humbleness. I know that Andrew hates that term, but I think it's a really interesting starting point. And, I'm not saying humbleness in a kind of a cynical way, because we can get pretty cynical pretty fast, when we think about our very kind of limited power compared to all the forces at play in making buildings and making cities. But, it's more about a humbleness that makes you realize that the power doesn't lie in an individual, but, rather it lies in a collective endeavor instead. I think that, things about curiosity and questioning, curiosity is about the complexities of the world and about the various communities that populate it, but also about questioning the status quo. It sounds a little bit cliche, but, is what we do really the best way to go about a project or about a question? Is it relevant? Is it still like in harmony with the contemporary moment of the city, and if it's not, then how can we change it? And then I think there's like notions, of course, of collaboration and of cross-pollination, in between domains, of course, which comes back to this idea of, this collective endeavor. But it's also about kind of searching for alternative modes of practice, again, to come back to this idea of regaining agency into the systems that really shape, environments. And to also kind of, piggyback on what Andrew was saying, I think there's also maybe another thing that is a little bit more, I guess, nuanced than that, but it's about shifting at least part of a focus from kind of traditional architectural production to some sort of an architectural projection, and not discrediting fiction as like a useless endeavor. Because I think that there's a lot of, sometimes very pragmatic students that don't see the value in like speculative studios and art collaboration and projects like that. And sometimes it's interesting to remind them that sometimes it's these types of collaboration and these types of approach have even like bigger impact than just like being stuck in this never-ending loop of pragmatism. So I think it's a way to kind of open up the discussion.
I mean, you've all just like laid out all these threads, and I want to pull all of them. I want to come back to Andrew's issue with the word humility. I want to talk about, the students struggling with the speculative work. I've seen that in my own design education, but it is 7:01. So I have one last question. You're all going to have to be brief, but I really want to know. We are in seasons. These are cycles. We will come back and question, how we renew our relevance as designers, as architects. And when we come to the next season, where we're interrogating the practice again, what conversation do you hope we've moved past? What baseline do you wish for architecture that we've sort of overcome? Whether it's this idea of the architect as the hero, whether it's, to Cheryl's point, centering people more consistently. What is the one thing that you hope for this profession as it goes through its renewal? And to keep your answers brief.
For me, it's, I think, hopefully the end of a conversation about sustainable architecture, that it's just so embedded in what we do that it's not a layer that you talk to a client about adding on. And I would have thought we were there by now a long time ago, but it's so slow, this industry, in adopting the just normative practice that we need to adopt, which is to just get to carbon zero, and a different way of thinking about building cities. We're still building all glass condominiums out of concrete, and it just doesn't make any sense. The buildings that we were building mid 20th century, the high rises in New York that were brick are more efficient than the buildings we're building now. So I think I just hope that we don't have to talk about that as if it's an add-on, that we accept that our buildings are going to be humane and sustainable. And then everything else should be the conversation, right? So that's mine.
Thank you. Andrew, Michael, Marie.
I'll jump in. And I'll try to do this really, really succinctly. I think one thing as we go through these cycles, I find that we tend to respond. We tend to decide that we want to just respond. And one thing that I find that's happening now is we are responding in the same way many, many components of our culture are responding to these issues. I think it's necessary, but I think it's cyclical. I think if we were going to have this conversation again, I'd like to find that we are in a place of fearlessness, that essentially then we are not the ones who are responding, and as a profession or as a discipline, we don't feel, oh, we need to adapt to this. We need to shift ourselves or shift our idea of what we are to these various elements. What we do is what we have is a skill set. And one thing we can be, or when we are fearless, when architecture and design is fearless, that's when it's at its best. The early modernist movement in terms of solving the housing problems of Northern Europe, and I know that's a Northern Europe problem, and I know it's about an ideology of a rarefied world, but there were problems that are resolved. It's the same response to technology, and I think we are responding to the resilience crisis. I think it is. I hope. I agree with Cheryl that it's disappointingly slow, but it's almost implicit that we are responding to that we are dealing with that. And as soon as we say, okay, we are dealing with that, then it allows us to then embrace fearlessness and move forward as designers in a way that hopefully is a little bit more, this is where I completely turn everything, this notion of heroic. I mean, I like the idea of heroic. If Michael can talk about the heroes, then this notion of a kind of, even if it's emblematic, even if it's only 2%, even if it's fragmented, it's still there and it exists, and it is heroic, and embrace the tragedy of that if you have to.
Yeah.
Let's be heroic or courageous enough not to build, right? Let's I'm going to say the bad thing, right? How do we survive without making buildings, bad buildings? And then how do we as designers design the new work that does not witness the atrocity that we've seen? What we do is the backdrop of what's happened. All of it. We could talk about all of it. In the secret places and stuff, it happens. It's happened. How do we, stop that through our design? That's that's what I'd like to enter our next discussion. How do we get paid for thinking?
Yes, love it. And Marie, last word to you.
Yeah, that's a big thing. Yeah, to I think there's something to the idea of fearlessness, but I think it's also about being fearless about our own agency and being humble at the same time, that we're not going to solve the problems of the world alone. Like, this is not going to happen. I really wish that the next time we talk, we get over this idea that a team of architects can resolve everyone's problem. This is not the case. It's not going to happen. We need to collaborate. We need to be cooperative. And I think that this is and goes back to this idea, maybe the answer is not to build. Let's be fearless about that, and let's be fearless about realizing what is our real kind of impact on the world, and it's through collaboration. And I think that if the next time we talk, next season that we talk, this is established, I think it's going to be a huge step.
That's brilliant. We're gonna see each other again soon in a world where architecture is fearless, humane, sustainable, heroic in our humility. Our thinking is a contribution, our process is valued, and we're humble about the limits of our capability, and we come together with others. So what a brilliant collective vision you've pulled together tonight. Thank you all, Andrew, Cheryl, Michael, Marie. You can't see, but I'm making eye contact with all of you and thanking you with gazing love, but really you're so brilliant, and all of your work is making such a massive contribution to moving this practice forward. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Nina.
All right, thank you so much, Zara. That was fantastic, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight: Cheryl, Michael, Andrew, Marie. I hope our guests found this insightful and enlightening as much as I did. There was a whole bunch of smiles behind the turned off camera, so thank you for that. And thank you to the team at DesignTO as well, including Deborah, Jeremy, Robin, and Michael. Always a pleasure to be working with that team as well. And special thanks to the team at Lemay who supported this event tonight. Be sure to visit designto.org to learn more about this year's programs and the virtual exhibitions, including Exchange Piece, a digital showcase of collaborations between emerging and established artists and designers that Lemay was very proud to support this year. And with that, I'll stop, wishing everyone who joined us a good and restful evening. Thank you, and have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
I humbly wish you all a good night.
The same.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Cheers. Take care.